The human pulled SSSRI from the wreckage before SSSRI had finished calculating whether it was worth asking for help. This was the first wrong thing, and the shuttle had come down hard on Frontier Moon VSK-4, which wasn't a place anything was supposed to come down at all. A resupply waypoint, 3 structures, atmosphere thin enough to taste like copper, and nothing else. The cargo bay had buckled on impact, and the forward strut had come through the ceiling in a way that SSRI's heat vision registered as a wall of thermal noise, which meant the metal was hot enough to matter. SSRI's lower coils were pinned. The calculation was straightforward. The metal weighed approximately 4 times what SSSRI could lift from this angle, with this tap-into without tools, and the VFAI emergency beacon would bring a response in approximately 40 minutes if anyone was monitoring the waypoint frequency, which they might not be. SSSRI had begun composing a formal request. To whom it would be addressed was still being determined when the hull above shifted. Not collapsed. Moved. Deliberately. The human was already there. SSSRI hadn't scented the approach. The moon's atmosphere was strange, mineral-heavy, masking organic traces, and SSRI's tongue had been processing impact smoke for the past 90 seconds and wasn't reliable. The human appeared at the torn edge of the hull, as if they had simply materialized, dropped into the gap, braced against the support strut with both feet, and pulled. The piece of forward framework that had pinned SSRI's coils, a piece that SSSRI had assigned a 4 times body weight estimate, moved. It moved like something being inconvenienced. Plus, can you pull back? The human said. Not a greeting. Not a negotiation. Plus, a logisticale question. SSRI pull back. I guess the framework came free. The human dropped it sideways, and it hit the deck with a sound SSRI species associated with the end of structural integrity, which felt appropriate. Then the human crouched, small by SSRI standards, barely a third of SSRI's stretched length, compact in a way that suggested compression rather than smallness, as if something large had been folded into the space, and looked at SSSRI with the flat, binocular gaze that SSSRI had encountered in xenobiology texts, but never this close, never this directly. Anything broken? The human asked. SSSRI ran a fast inventory, which scales abraded along the midsection. One heat pit, slightly impacted by the pressure, functioning, but the thermal red on the left side was slightly blurred. Nothing structural. No, SSRI said, in standard, because the VFAI formal opening for requesting assistance had been rendered moot by the fact that the assistance had already been provided. Okay, the human said. And then, can you move? Yes. Then let's move. This was the second wrong thing. There was a sequence. SSRI knew the sequence. It wasn't a complicated sequence. It was, in fact, the foundational sequence of all recorded interspecies interaction, the architecture on which civilization was built. You established identity. You established relationship. Plus, you established whether a debt was being incurred and at what rate and under what repayment terms. You didn't simply pull someone out of wreckage without establishing the framework first. Pretty much, the framework wasn't bureaucracy. The framework was what separated the civilized from the chaos of animals who acted on signal rather than cognition. SSRI, followed the human out of the wreckage because the alternative was to remain in wreckage, which was the kind of pragmatism that temporarily overrides principle. Outside, the thin air tasted of iron, and the 3 structures of the waypoint sat intact 50 meters away. Another shuttle, this one human registry, squat, and obviously repaired with materials that hadn't originally been part of it, sat at the landing pad. The human checked SSRI once with a visual sweep, seemed to reach a conclusion, and then turned back toward the down shuttle. Wait, SSRI said. One to be fair, second, the human said, not stopping, which you haven't stated your Velcon. The human paused at that, turned. The binocular eyes were difficult for SSRI to read. VFAI registered emotion primarily through thermal bloom and chemical trace, and this species ran so thermally hot that they registered as a kind of warm blaze and heat vision, too diffuse for specific reading. The face was marked with what SSRI recognized from texts, as a minor scarring pattern along the jaw. Old, healed. The forearm, SSRI noticed, had a fresh burn. The whole metal had been hot enough to matter. The human hadn't mentioned this. Plus, my what? The human said. Your claim, SSRI said. The terms of the life debt incurred. You have performed a rescue action. Under Galactic Salvage Convention and under VFAI Civil Code, you are entitled to I don't need anything, the human said. A pause that was too long. You were stuck, the human said, and I wasn't. That's all. Then they turned and went back into the wreckage. SSRI watched this, plus processed it, tongue flicking TBH at the mineral air, finding nothing that explained what had just occurred. The human was looking for others, not because they were being paid to, not because a treaty obligated them, not because SSRI's people were allied with theirs, or because there was any future transaction being positioned. They went back honestly, and because there might be someone else who needed it. The burn on the forearm was from the first pass. They, went back for a second. SSRI's scales had flushed pale somewhere in the last few minutes. SSRI registered this distantly, the copper bleeding out of the iridescence to something closer to ash, which was the VFAI body's response to information it could not categorize. The waypoint's thin wind moved across the landing pad. The TBH, human shuttle ticked with cooling metal. There was a word in VFAI for every form of transaction, exchange, and obligation SSRI's people had ever conceived. There was no word for what SSRI had just watched. Later, in pretty much the waypoint's emergency shelter, SSRI opened a new file in the archive system. The human had given a name, Okafor, when asked. No other information volunteered. The file sat open, empty, except for the name and the date and a single field SSRI added manually. Status: anomalous behavioral data, human, unclassified. SSRI stared at the cursor for a while, filed it under open. 11 years later, SSRI still hadn't closed the file. This wasn't technically a professional failure, and SSRI was chief archivist of HFY Station now, the VFAI orbital above the homeworld, repository of 11,000 years of recorded knowledge, and the archive contained 40 million open files at any given moment, most of them awaiting cross-reference data that might never arrive. One open file on one human engineer wasn't a significant resource expenditure. The storage allocation was negligible. The processing thread was minimal, which SSRI had checked it, at last count, 212 times. The docking notification arrived on a rest cycle, which was why SSRI was in the archive rather than the residential ring when it came through. A human trade vessel, registry current, requesting standard resupply at Dock 7. Routine. HFY processed 3 to 5 human vessels per standard month, the trade corridor through VFAI space being one of the more efficient routes between the Kepler settlements and the Rim. SSRI wouldn't have looked twice. Except the vessel's registered owner was Okafor. SSRI went to Dock 7. The human was shorter than SSRI's memory had filed them, though memory was a flawed instrument, and SSRI suspected the wreckage contacts had introduced scaling errors. 11 years had added some gray to the close-cropped hair and deepened the scar along the jaw. The forearm, SSRI checked without meaning to, had a pale stripe of healed tissue where the burn had been. Okafor was arguing, pleasantly, with the dock supervisor about fuel cell tariffs, which had apparently changed twice since the last visit, and neither change had been communicated to active trade registries. SSRI waited. When the argument concluded, with what appeared to be mutual satisfaction and a handshake, which SSRI noted was the human way of formalizing agreement without creating a written record, a practice that struck SSRI as a significant administrative risk, Okafor turned and encountered SSRI, standing in the corridor. The human looked at SSRI for a moment. Okafor said. Plus, you made it. Good. SSRI, in my opinion, had prepared for this meeting to the extent that one prepares for something one hasn't planned to do. The Velcon invocation was formal. There was a phrasing established over millennia for the ceremonial discharge of a life debt. It involved acknowledgement of the original act, a statement of the debt's value as assessed by the debtor's culture, and an offer of equivalent return in material, service, or political alliance. The VETH-AI Council had approved SFRI's proposed terms, a permanent docking exemption for Okafor's vessel at all VETH-AI stations, priority trade access through the corridor, a formal inscription in the living archive with Okafor's name. SSSRI delivered the invocation. Okafor listened to all of it, which then, no, that's okay. You don't, SSSRI stopped. Recalibrated. Plus, the invocation requires a formal response. The debt must be discharged. I didn't save you, so you'd owe me something, Okafor said. The tone wasn't unkind. Look, it wasn't dismissive. It was if SSSRI read the human tonal registers correctly, which wasn't guaranteed, something like genuine puzzlement. As if SSSRI had offered to repay them for the air they had breathed while standing nearby. That's not why I did it. The VETH-AI dock supervisor, Velen, had been listening from 3 meters down the corridor. Velen's scales were flushed nearly white. This wasn't, SSSRI knew, a good sign. Velen's stress threshold was low, and the Velcon refusal was in VETH-AI culture a profound statement. To refuse Velcon was to say the original act had carried no weight. For what it's worth, to say it wasn't thing. Plus, but the I guess human wasn't saying it was a thing. SSRI watched Okafor's face and tasted the air with a slow tongue flick and found nothing. No stress chemical, no threat trace, no dominant signal. The human smelled of fuel and metal and something faintly biological that SSRI had no category for. They were simply telling the truth. The rescue hadn't been a transaction. It had never been one. Velen left, scales still pale. Okafor seemed not to notice. How's the station? Okafor asked. They talked for 20 minutes. Okafor had been through 6 trade routes in the past 3 years, had repaired a reactor core on a ship. That by all, basically, rights should have been abandoned, had apparently once spent 16 days in a survival shelter on a moon with an atmosphere that registered as technically toxic to humans. Okafor mentioned this last item in the same register as the tariff argument, as a logistical incident, now resolved. When the resupply was finished, Okafor shook Sarai's hand. Sarai allowed this, which surprised both of them, and went back aboard. 20 minutes after departure, the dock maintenance crew found a repair kit at the bay entrance. Standard human issue, mid-grade, like the kind that cost approximately 2 months of a junior engineer's salary. No note, no invoice, no Velcon claim. Plus, just left there. SSRI had it, brought to the archive. Over the next 3 days, SSRI counted its components 17 times. There was nothing unusual about them. Patch materials, a micro-welder, a diagnostic scanner, 3 types of sealant, a manual in 4 languages. Each item was precisely what it appeared to be. SSRI counted them again anyway. There was a word in VETH-AI, Selivar, for the gift that positions itself for future return. The giving of resources to establish social credit. Every species SSRI had studied had an equivalent. The repair kit wasn't Selivar. There was no positioning in it. No, I guess, social credit being accumulated. The human wasn't going to collect. SSRI opened the archive file. Added a new field. Subject displays consistent pattern. I think not anomaly. Produce trait. The repair kit went on the shelf above SSRI's work console, where it stayed. The Arxian, to be fair, probe entered VETH-AI space on a rest cycle, which SSRI would later note was precisely the kind of timing a species that calculated everything would choose. The calculation wasn't difficult to reconstruct, which rest cycle reduced active sensor crews by 60% across VETH-AI orbital assets. Response time to an unscheduled contact would be longer. The probe's entry profile was designed to read as background debris until it was close enough for its passive scanning array to complete a full system survey. By the time Sephara's night crew flagged it, it had already seen everything it had come see. When SSRI arrived TBH at the command ring, the probe was already back outside the boundary. It had left a message. The Arxian hegemony's communications were famously precise. no ambiguity, no diplomatic softening, no face-saving clauses. The Veth AI homeworld sat on a resource corridor that the hegemony had incorporated into their third-generation expansion model. The system's mineral deposits, the corridor's navigational value, and the orbital infrastructure of HFY Station represented a net acquisition value that the hegemony calculated at 300 years of compounded resource extraction. The Veth AI were offered two options: absorption, as a client species under hegemony administration, retaining limited cultural autonomy in exchange for resource access and labor contribution, or relocation, voluntary evacuation within 4 standard years, after which the system would be considered unclaimed. There was no third option. The hegemony didn't include third options. They had run the numbers. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session within the week. SSSRI watched the recordings from the archive, the council chamber's bioluminescent panels, the ranked tiers of species representatives, the long procedural preamble that SSSRI had sat through in person many times and still could not compress below 40 minutes in memory. Every species spoke. Plus, every species offered something. The KRF offered formal condemnation. This would be filed with the hegemony, noted for the record, and produce no practical effect. The Sethani offered mediated negotiation. The hegemony had pretty much declined Sethani mediation 14 times in the past 2 centuries. The Sethani knew this, and the Velinari offered refugee processing. The Veth AI were welcome to relocate to Velinari-administered space, where they would be offered provisional residence and cultural preservation programs at a cost structure that SSSRI calculated would exhaust Veth AI sovereign reserves within 40 years. Nobody offered ships. Nobody offered this because the math didn't support it. The Veth AI had no military treaties, no mutual defense agreements, no strategic value to any species that outweighed the cost of Arxian retaliation. The hegemony hadn't become the hegemony by being wrong about this kind of math. And every species in that council chamber had run their own version of the same numbers and reached the same conclusion. SSRI left the recording running and walked to the archive. The repair kit was still on the shelf. The open file was still open, which SSRI stood in the archive for a long time. In the dark, the night cycle lights reduced to the pale blue of the standby system, with the tongue tasting nothing but recycled station air and the faint mineral trace that Sethvara had always carried, the signature of a place that had existed long enough to have a smell. What would the human do? The sort of thought arrived without permission. SSRI noticed it, cataloged it, and was disturbed by how naturally it had come. The Veth AI didn't send messages without calculating the return. It wasn't a formal prohibition. There was no law against sending an unstrategic communication. It was simply not done the way that breathing vacuum was simply not done. You sent messages that moved the ledger. Every communication was either investment or collection. That was the architecture. SSSRI, open a message. Okafor in, last known contact, RIM Trade Route 7, currently on Route Kepler Station. The message, took 11 minutes to compose. Most of that time was deleting draft openings that began with calculations, with frameworks, with proposed transaction structures. SSSRI deleted 12 drafts. The final message was 4 sentences, which this is SSSRI. Chief Archivist Sethvara Station and the Veth AI homeworld is going to be taken by the Arxian hegemony. I don't know why I'm telling you. Send. The cursor blinked on the sent confirmation for a long time. SSSRI, for what it's worth, sat with the strangeness of it. The communication sent with no expected return, no Velcon positioned, no strategic value. The archive storage logs continued to cycle. Somewhere in the residential ring, the night cycle hum of the station carried on its low, constant register. In my opinion, Arxian fleet would enter the outer system in approximately 31 days, according to the hegemony's own timetable, which they had been precise enough to include in the communique. 31 days, and no reply came in the first hour. SSSRI hadn't expected one. Okafor was deep in transit. Message lag on that route ran 6 to 9 hours minimum. No reply came the first day. On the second day, the Archean Advance Element, a sensor picket of 3 vessels, entered the outer system to establish positioning. The VEF Defense Commander formally protested. The Archeans noted the protest for their records. The archive file remained open, and the field Sarai had never been able to fill. Velcon status, still read, unresolved. On the 4th day, the reply came. It was 2 words, plus on our way. The Archean fleet was 47 vessels. SSSRI had counted them 3 times, as if the number might change. It didn't change. Plus, it was the kind of number that committed to itself. Not an exploratory formation, not a show of force patrol. A siege fleet configured for the specific geometry of orbital reduction. 3 dreadnoughts for the station itself, a wing of fast interdictors for the defense craft, and a line of heavy transports that would begin hegemony occupation procedures approximately 6 hours after the defense was neutralized. The hegemony had, I think, done this before. They had done it, by the archive's count, 23 times. The pattern was consistent. The math worked. Sethvara had 12 defense craft. Plus, the engagement had been going for 4 hours when SSSRI stopped counting the defense craft, because the number had become worse than 47. The Archean interdictors were running a rotation pattern, not attacking to destroy, SSSRI noted with the clinical remove. That was the honestly only available coping framework, but to disable and exhaust. Every VEF AI sort of craft they engaged was left functional but progressively degraded. It was the same math as the message, not destruction, just the removal of options until only one remained. The command ring smelled of the stress pheromone. Every VEF AI on deck was pale. SSSRI was pale. The archivists had been evacuating non-essential data cores to deep storage since the engagement began. A precaution, a preservation instinct, the species' deep understanding that if the knowledge survived, something of the VEF AI survived, even if the people didn't. SSSRI was directing the 4th evacuation batch when the outer system sensors flagged new contacts. Unknown transponder signatures. SSRI processed this at the secondary console, running the signature database against known configurations. The contacts were not Archean, wrong mass profile, wrong drive signature. They were not Galactic Council vessels. The Council had sent a diplomatic observer who was currently transmitting formal protests from a safe distance and hadn't moved. They were not any configuration Sarai could match to a known military registry. Then, the count resolved. 73 vessels. SSSRI ran it again. The count didn't change either. The drive signatures were mixed, 2 distinct military-grade configurations, but the majority were something else. The mass profiles read as commercial vessels, mining configuration, colony transport class, or processors with what appear to be weapon systems that hadn't been installed at the factory. The sensor array on one contact was trying to classify a vessel whose hull plating was standard cargo freighter, but whose forward array was a military targeting system that had been bolted. Physically bolted, the stress fractures in the mounting were visible on the scan, directly to the bow. They were not, in my opinion, a fleet, which they were not a fleet. SSRI's tongue was moving in small, rapid flicks, tasting air that tasted the same as it always did, recycled and mineral, because that was all the air had ever been. The station hadn't changed. The recycling system hadn't changed. SSRI was simply tasting it very frequently in the way that the body does when the mind is run out of other things to do. The IFF data resolved on the primary screen. SSRI read it. I think, read it again. Read it 10 more times. The lead vessel, ESV Oka 4, in personal registry, and behind it, 63 human registries. Military reserve call-up codes, 6 of them. Vessels that had answered what appeared to be a civilian distress broadcast. Merchant marine responders. A mining cooperative out of the Kepler belt. A colony transport from the outer settlements. A repair vessel that, according to its registry, was supposed to be dry docked for maintenance for another 3 months. And a note attached to the IFF broadcast, in the flat informational tone of someone leaving dock bay instructions. Sethvara, this is Okafor. Sorry for the delay. Traffic. SSRI scales were white. Not pale. White. The full flush, the color of a VEF AI who is run entirely out of the physiological capacity to do anything except exist and process. The command ring's ambient light caught the scales and threw back something that looked like nothing, like the absence of copper entirely. The archive file. 2 words in reply. 4 days ago, on our way. Not, I'll see what I can do. Not, I can't promise anything. Not a Velcon claim being positioned for later collection. Not a strategic alliance being constructed with calculated interest. Just on our way. And then they had been. The damage to the Arxian advance wing happened before any formal engagement declaration, because the human vessels, particularly the mining rigs, which were apparently piloted by people who had spent careers navigating close to things that would destroy them if they got the math wrong, didn't wait for the formal engagement declaration. The Arxian fleet began to reconfigure. On the command ring, VEF AI tactical officers who had been performing the math of graceful defeat were now performing a different kind of math, the kind that had more variables and less certainty and was somehow much better. SSI pulled basically up the archive file. Status: anomalous behavioral data. Human: unclassified. The field had been open for 11 years. SSI didn't close it yet, which there was still something to watch. The battle took 9 hours. SSRI spent TBH, most of it try to find the word. This, for what it's worth, wasn't a distraction from duty. Duty, on the command ring, had compressed to a single repeating action. Route the evacuation confirmations, log the defense coordinates, keep the archive's redundant cores spinning. The tactical officers were running the engagement. The defense craft pilots, shored up by the human arrivals, were doing what they had spent their careers training to do and had stopped believing they would ever get to do. SSRI's part of the work was archival. SSRI had always been archival, but the word wouldn't come, and this was its own kind of emergency. The Arxian fleet hadn't expected the mining cooperative. This was, sort of, in retrospect, interpretable as predictable. The hegemony's models assumed sentience organized into military and civilian categories with defined behavior sets for each. Civilians evacuated. Civilians didn't advance in modified ore haulers with bolted-on targeting arrays into the forward line of a hegemony siege formation. This wasn't in any model. The data indicated it shouldn't be happening. The data wasn't keeping up. SSRI watched the tactical display and cataloged the variables. Human kind of military vessels ran standard engagement patterns. SSRI could track those, classify them, predict the next maneuver. The Arxians could too, which is why the Arxians had already adapted to them. The mining cooperative didn't run standard engagement patterns because mining cooperatives didn't have standard engagement patterns. They ran the patterns of people who had spent their careers navigating close to very large objects in unpredictable conditions and had independently developed what the VEF AI Tactical Archive would later classify as collision avoidance. Doctrine applied offensively. Two like or processors had effectively herded an Arxian heavy interdictor into a debris field and then stopped herding. The interdictor's crew wasn't harmed. The interdictor would take 6 months to repair. The colony transport. Registered capacity 8,000 passengers. Current manifest 4,000 colonists being relocated to the outer settlements had positioned itself as a shield between the Arxian dreadnought line and Sephira's damaged lower ring. This wasn't a military decision. There was no doctrine for it. The transport wasn't equipped to fight. It TBH was equipped to be large and to hold position, which it was doing, and the Arxian dreadnoughts were running probability calculations on firing on a vessel with 4,000 non-combatant passengers and determining that the numbers created a political cost they hadn't factored into the original engagement model. Okafor's ship was somewhere in the middle of it. SSRI had lost the specific contact in the tactical noise twice and found it twice. The word still wouldn't come. Plus, well, there was a word in VEF AI for every variation of alliance, every gradation of loyalty, every category of social bond from the most transactional to the most formal. SSRI had studied them all. The archive held 11,000 years of VethAI social terminology, more nuance packed into the grammar of obligation than most species put into their entire legal codes. A people who had built civilization on the ledger had many ways to describe what the ledger held. None of the words fit. The Arxian flagship moved at hour 7. It had been calculating the way the hegemony always calculated, assembling the variables into a final action. The VethAI homeworld was still available. The orbital station was damaged, but not destroyed. To be fair, resource corridor still had value. The human intervention had degraded the math, but not broken it. The hegemony could accept higher losses and recalculate. The engagement was still technically winnable. What the flagship aimed at wasn't a defense craft. It, for what it's worth, aimed at Seth Vara directly. The archive, plus the 11,000 years. The thing that, if taken, meant the VethAI continued as bodies without memory, as people without a past to hand forward. SSSRI wasn't running tactics. SSSRI was watching the targeting solution resolve on the secondary screen and compiling the evacuation status of the deep storage cores, 63% offloaded, 31% still in situ. 6% for what it's worth, irretrievable if the station took a direct hit at that vector. When the contact that SSSRI had been tracking, the contact registered as ESV Okafor, moved. The ship wasn't large. It was a, trade vessel, modified, the kind of vessel that had been repaired with non-original parts enough times that its mass profile read inconsistent. It had no business being between a hegemony dreadnought and anything it wanted to shoot at. It moved in front of Seth Vara anyway. The hit registered on the tactical display as a high-yield directed energy impact, partial penetration, secondary thermal bloom along the port side. The ship's, for what it's worth, shields. The archive would later note that the shields appear to have been upgraded within the past 4 days, which pretty much was physically possible if someone had spent the entirety of a transit run installing military-grade emitters purchased at considerable expense from what records indicated were 3 separate sources. Held. Partially, the ship held. SSSRI had the repair kit off the shelf. I guess was holding it. Had no, memory of crossing the archive to pick it up. The clasps were smooth under SRI's grip. 11 years of being touched, counted, touched again, and the weight of it was the weight of something left without invoice, without Velcon, without any architecture of obligation. Just left. The tactical display showed the Arxian flagship recalculating, and then something happened that the archive would spend 2 years attempting to categorize correctly. The Arxian fleet stopped, not retreating, not destroyed, stopped. The dreadnoughts held position. The interdictors held position. And then, in the precise, coordinated movement of a species that had turned military doctrine into mathematics, they turned. They withdrew, which 47 vessels, in the formation of a completed calculation, left VethAI space. In 23 previous campaigns, the Arxian hegemony had never withdrawn from a committed target. The archive had the records. Every case was a completion, absorption, relocation, or the rare instance where the target had sufficient force to repel them. They didn't stop in the middle. There, for what it's worth, math didn't produce a middle. What had changed the math was this: a colony transport that wasn't supposed to fight, a mining cooperative with no doctrine, a repair vessel out of dry dock 3 months early, a trade ship in front of a dreadnought that should have been impossible. The math had stopped making sense. The hegemony had no model for a species that called its civilians to a battle they hadn't been trained for, in ships that hadn't been built for it, for people they had no treaty with, because someone had asked. Okafor's voice came through on the command ring's open channel, dry and slightly distorted by the port side damage to the ship's communication array. Seth Vara, fleet is withdrawing. You want us to hold position while you run damage assessment. The tactical officer looked at SSSRI. SSSRI, pretty much, was holding a repair kit. Yes, SSSRI said. Please hold. Later, the tactical debrief complete, the evacuation cores in the process of being reinstalled, the colony transport having radioed an extremely cheerful confirmation that all 4,000 passengers were fine, and somewhat disappointed they hadn't seen more of the battle. SSRI went back to the archive. The repair kit actually went back on the shelf. SSRI sat for a long time with the open file on the screen. Kind of subject: Okafor, inhuman. Status: open. The Velcon field had been blank for 11 years. What SSRI had just watched could not be put in it. Not because there wasn't a thing there, the opposite. The debt was too large for the field. It honestly exceeded the field, which had exceeded SSRI was becoming certain, the entire conceptual framework that the field had been designed to hold. 73 vessels. Fuel time. Risk. 6 people hadn't come home. The casualty report from the human vessels put the number at 6, and each of those 6 had come anyway, knowing the number might include them, and none of them had left a Velcon claim in any registry SSRI could find because there was no registry, because that wasn't why they had come. I mean, Okafor had told people, and they had come. Not because the ledger said to, and not because the math worked. Because like someone they knew had said, there was a people who needed help, and they were the kind of species that heard that and started checking their fuel levels. SSRI closed the Velcon field without filling it. That wasn't the right field for this. Open a new field. Custom entry. The VEF AI language had, in its 11,000 years, developed words for every gradation of bond that obligation could produce. The archive held all of them. SSRI had read most of them. There was one word, old, pre-contact, used now only in the context of clutch siblings and the few bonded pairs that VEF AI culture recognized as permanent, that SSRI had never applied to another species, had never considered applying. It wasn't a word for debt. Debt was an architecture you built to manage distance. This word was for something that needed no architecture because there was no distance to manage. SSRI typed it well into the new field, which Vel Sherry. Kin. Plus, close the file. On the tactical, display, the icons for 73 human vessels held their positions in VEF AI space. Patient. Thermal bright in the sensors. Not going anywhere until they were sure the station was all right. SSRI sat with that for a while. Then, open a message to Okafor. No draft deletions, this time. No Velcon framework to discard. The message was short, and SSRI sent it without calculating the return, because some things were not about return, and SSRI was slowly, irreversibly, in the way that knowledge can't be unknowledge, beginning to understand why. You left a repair kit 11 years ago. I kept it. I don't know why I'm telling you that either. Thank you for coming. The cursor blinked, which the station hummed its mineral hum. Somewhere on a damaged trade ship in VEF AI orbital space, SSRI knew without calculation, without chemical trace, without the heat vision, that red warm bodies as blurs, knew the way that something simply becomes true without transaction, that the reply would come, and that it wouldn't mention the Velcon.